My next guest went from being an undocumented immigrant to a best-selling author and reporter on MSNBC. Please welcome Daniela Pierre-Bravo, a reporter for MSNBC and the author of the book, The Other, How to Own Your Power at Work as a Woman of Color. Daniela, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Julia, it's so good to be with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so just to get started, I read The Other. I thought it was a fantastic read. Explain for our viewers who haven't read it what The Other means.
The Other is basically seeing yourself through the eyes of somebody else. And it's really at the core and the heart of the book. It is intended for women who have felt like the other, who have felt overlooked, and who follow these rules, these unwritten rules of inclusion in order to find belonging and success. And I talk about my own story, trying to find success through assimilation, and I profile other women of color. And it's not just my story, but it's the story of so many women who basically lose themselves and fragment their identities in order to find success. And then as they move along in their careers, they have trouble taking up space. So this book is all about kind of understanding our journeys and empowering us and really showing women how to use their power when they do have a seat at the table.
Yeah, and your story is so remarkable. After you emigrated to the United States from Chile, you lived in Lima, Ohio, and I know that you went to Miami of Ohio after that, and then ended up in New York City. But a lot of your journey was as an undocumented immigrant, and there was one passage from the book that really was powerful to me when President Obama announced, I believe it was in 2012, that he was granting that temporary relief to dreamers, younger people who had been brought here as minors to the United States, and how you were in that deli watching this play out and you wanted to hug everyone around you, but everyone was just acting like it was business as usual. But I'm curious, you grew up in a very predominantly white town, conservative-leaning town. What was, did you have a community? Obviously you had your family, but were you able to connect with other people, for example, online, people of color, other undocumented immigrants who really shared more of your experience?
Thank you for that question. It was actually very alienating. I had no idea people like me existed. I remember being 15 and 16 years old, not knowing that there was another undocumented person. I was kind of looking in the corners of the internet for community boards to try to find people like me. And so thank you for bringing up that moment in the deli when President Obama delivered his speech on executive action, because it didn't just give me an opportunity to have an identity, an ID, but it allowed me to understand that there were almost 1 million people like me. And that sense of being seen and that sense of having a community of people who have gone through the same thing was incredibly empowering, because I was doing all of these things in vain. And I actually don't think my story is unique at all. I think it's the story of so many women of color around this country who work hard, who have to take 2 or 3 jobs to get themselves through college, who do the unpaid internships, plus 4 side jobs. For me, I know you read this, but lying on my resume and saying that I lived in New York City so that I could get a call back for an unpaid internship in New York. And so it's that grit and resilience that is a great thing to have. But in the book, I talk about how in some ways, as you move along, you operate on those same rules, and it doesn't always lead to success.
Yeah, and you also talk about essentially imposter syndrome. And I think women in general go through this. I go through this. But for women of color, there's an added layer to it, and it's a whole other ball game of feeling that you've reached this point in your career, or you're in this program in your education, and you just almost sometimes feel like you don't necessarily deserve it, or you're wondering, why am I here? Why me? How can we as women, and of course particularly women of color, push back against that feeling of imposter syndrome?
Well, first, it's understanding the context of which we hear or feel that way. If we're talking about women of color, I've interviewed a lot of women of color for my book, and I've done research on this. The women that are coming up actually don't have a confidence problem. what they're actually up against is real microaggressions and covert and overt racism. And so when we talk about imposter syndrome and kind of feeling like you don't deserve to be there, a lot of these women have been made to feel like they don't deserve to be there through microaggressions and through covert and overt bias. And so it's something that's important to understand, because the message in the book is that it's not you. It's you're not the problem. And I think a lot of us internalize that for ourselves because we, in some way, shaped or form, our identities have been kind of intertwined with this feeling of not being good enough, of being the one and the only. And so when we talk about imposter syndrome, I think it's important to have that context.
Yeah, and if the problem is, the surroundings of a woman or, her environment, how can we work to change that environment? I know that's a loaded question. Sometimes in larger organizations, it's difficult to, but where does this begin? How can we start at the grassroots level to start lifting up women and women of color to where they don't have to deal with, as many microaggressions or microaggressions at all?
It starts from the top down. When we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, this. There's billions of dollars being spent on these efforts, which is great. But what often happens, and the women that I've interviewed also told me this, is that they're recruited, they get there, they have a seat at the table, but then they're dismissed or discarded or not really allowed to do their job because people are not comfortable seeing someone like them with power. And so I think it's an institutional and a structural problem. In the book, I really talk about practical tips on the parts that we can actually control, which is limited. But if we're talking about a big solution, it absolutely starts from the top down.
Yeah, and you talk about, I think you wrote about this one experience from a woman you interviewed, I think a young Latina woman. She was working for a larger firm, and she was called into a meeting for cosmetics that were owned, Latina-owned cosmetics, I believe. And then it became clear that she was it seemed to me that she was being used as a prop, and she ended up walking away and started her own company, which is amazing. But, that's a risk. And you've taken a number of risks throughout, your journey and in your career. So, I would love to hear your advice on women who are looking to take a risk in their career to maybe walk away from an environment or a situation that isn't serving them.
Yeah, what I talk about in the book is really to examine our relationship with risk. For a lot of women who started out with little, or women of color, there's a sense that if you mess something up or if you don't do the right thing, then that opportunity is fleeting and then it'll be automatically taken away from you. And a lot of us haven't seen that generational opportunity open up for our families. And so when you are the first and you are the only and you have that seat at the table, it can be intimidating to take that risk. But I think the pandemic also showed this, that women having a seat at the table but not being able to use it, there is a burnout and there's a frustration. And so this is what you're going to see. And this is a call to companies to say, if you don't give women equity, they're going to burn out and they're going to go out and do their own thing. And, I think it's one of the reasons why you see so many numbers of entrepreneurial women, especially women of color, that are sort of coming up in these last couple of years, because they are not seeing that equity in their workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up such an important point about the seat at the table. We use that phrase so much, but what's important is that we can use that seat of the table and use our voices and empower those around us to use their voices. Daniela Pierre-Bravo, thank you so much for joining me.
Julia, thank you so much.